Britain's most famous medieval street. Today it is filled with tourists. Cameras click. Laughter echoes off old timber walls. It looks like something from a fairy tale. But here's a question. What if the fairy tale is a lie? What if the very same street that sells fudge and souvenirs once ran with something far darker? Another question. Why does no one ever look down at the gutter? Tonight we walk a path millions have photographed, but few have truly seen. A street where beauty was built on blood, where charm hides centuries of horror, where the past is not buried. It is waiting right beneath your feet. Before we begin, if you enjoy history that goes deeper than the postcard version, subscribe. Not because I asked, because you want to know what else is hiding in plain sight. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let us walk Britain's most famous medieval street. The real one. Britain's most famous medieval street was never meant to be beautiful. That is the first lie the postcards sell you. Because beauty requires intention. It requires planning and clean lines and a future someone dreamed up ahead of time. The Shambles had none of that. What it had was mud and money and a desperate need for space. York of the 1100s was already old when the Normans arrived. The Romans had been here. The Vikings had been here. Each group left behind walls and roads, and the bones of a city that grew without a map. No architect designed the Shambles. It was not sketched on parchment or approved by a king. It simply happened, like a bruise, like a rumor, like something that spreads because no one bothered to stop it. The street began as a shortcut, a narrow passage connecting the busy market to the river. Merchants liked it because it was fast. Customers liked it because it was direct. Soon a few stalls appeared, then wooden shops, then homes built on top of the shops, because land inside York's walls became more expensive every year. So they built upward. They built outward. They built over the street itself. Upper floors stretched across the narrow lane until they almost touched the building opposite. Daylight struggled to reach the ground, and the street became a tunnel. A crooked, dark tunnel of timber and plaster that leaned like a man who had drunk too much ale. That was the first secret. The Shambles was not designed. It was improvised. Generation after generation added rooms and beams and floors without ever asking if the foundations could bear the weight. And somehow the foundations did bear it. But they also began to shift, slowly at first, then more noticeably. By the 1300s, the buildings were visibly tilting, not falling, just leaning, as if the street itself was growing tired of standing upright. The locals did not mind. They had bigger problems. Because while the buildings leaned, the ground beneath them grew soft with something far less innocent than rain. Here is where the story takes a darker turn. The Shambles was not built for beauty. It was built for butchers. And butchers bring blood. Not the clean blood of a kitchen. Not the polite blood of a modern grocery store wrapped in plastic. This was blood that ran open from the throat of an animal slaughtered feet from where customers stood. This was blood that drained into the street and mixed with mud and clung to the bottom of wool skirts and leather boots and did not wash away until the next rain. And sometimes not even then. Imagine walking that narrow tunnel, the buildings leaning overhead like conspirators whispering secrets, the light thin and pale, the ground wet beneath your feet even when the sky was dry, and the smell, not the sharp smell of fresh meat, something older, something sweet in a sick way, the smell of fat left in the sun, the smell of hides piled in corners, the smell of something that had died and been left to consider its choices. That was the Shambles before it became a postcard. That was the street that tourists now call charming. But the blood was only the beginning, because where blood flows, other things follow. Flies came first, then rats, then the kind of attention no street wants. The Shambles became known for its butchers, but also for its secrets. Doors that stayed closed during daylight, windows that opened only at night, whispers that traveled faster than a horse could gallop. A medieval street full of sharp knives and nervous money and people who had seen too much to sleep soundly. The buildings leaned because the ground softened, and the ground softened because something was always draining into it. Not just animal blood, not just rainwater, but the runoff from every stall, every shop, every hidden room where deals were made that no one spoke about aloud. The Shambles was never meant to be beautiful. It was meant to be useful, and usefulness in the Middle Ages meant accepting the unpleasant parts, the parts that polite society prefers to forget. A street of butchers is also a street of death. Every morning animals arrived alive. By noon, they were hanging from hooks. By evening, their remains were in the gutter. And by midnight, the rats held their own feasts. This cycle repeated for centuries. So when you see a photograph of a shambles today, with its hanging flower baskets and its warm golden lights, remember what those flowers hide. The timber beneath them is soaked with centuries of work that involved cutting and draining and the slow, steady rhythm of a cleaver meeting bone. The street remembers. The walls remember. And if you stand very still in the early morning before the tourists arrive, you might feel something watching you. Not a ghost. Something heavier. The weight of everything that was done here. Everything that was sold here. Everything that was washed into the gutter and forgotten. That is the real foundation of the shambles. Not stone, not wood, but a kind of silence that follows all old places. The silence of people who worked until their hands bled, and then worked some more because the animals kept arriving and the customers kept waiting, and the street did not care about beauty. It only cared about business. And business was very, very good. So the buildings leaned. The ground softened. The light dimmed. And the shambles became exactly what it needed to become. A machine for turning living creatures into money. Beautiful? No, never. But honest in a way that makes modern tourists uncomfortable. Because honesty about the past means admitting that some of our most treasured places were built on things we would rather not name. The shambles hides its darker past in plain sight. Every crooked beam is a confession. Every worn step is a testimony. And the gutter that tourists step over without a second glance once carried a river of red that never stopped flowing. That is the first keynote. And it leads directly into the second. Because once the street became a machine for butchers, something else moved in. Something that made the blood look almost innocent. Once the street became a machine for butchers, something else moved in. Something that made the blood look almost innocent. Because blood washes away. Rain sees to that. A good storm scrubs the gutters, and the mud swallows the rest. But what happens when the butchers stop being a handful of shops and become the entire street? That is exactly what happened in the shambles. By the 1200s, nearly every building on both sides of that narrow lane was connected to the meat trade. Not just selling meat, butchering it, hanging it, preparing it, and disposing of everything that could not be sold. The name shambles comes from an old word, fleshambles, meaning the benches or shelves where meat was displayed. So the street's very name was a confession. Every time someone said it, they were saying the place of open flesh. That is not charm. That is a warning. And yet the butchers kept coming. They came because York was growing. The city needed meat. Not occasionally. Not as a luxury. Every single day, hundreds, if not thousands of people needed to eat. The wealthy wanted beef and pork. The poor took whatever was cheapest. The monasteries demanded meat for feast days. And the butchers were happy to supply it. But here is where the story turned strange. The shambles did not have a slaughterhouse on the edge of town. It did not have a modern facility with drains and cold storage and employees who go home and wash their hands. The animals were brought directly to the street, on hoof, walking through the same narrow lane that tourists now wander with ice cream cones. Cows, pigs, sheep, sometimes goats, all of them driven through the mud and the crowd and the shouting merchants. They could smell the blood before they arrived. Animals know. They can smell fear and death and the copper tang of a fresh kill. By the time a pig reached the shambles, it was already panicking. That panic made the meat tougher. The butchers did not care. They had work to do. The animal was tied or held or simply struck where it stood. The knife went in. The blood came out. And within minutes the carcass was hanging from a hook outside the shop. Open to the air. Open to the flies. Open to the eyes of every person who walked past. That was the display. Not refrigerated glass. Not neat packages. A dead animal cut open and offered to the world like a promise. The medieval shopper did not flinch. They had grown up seeing this. To them, the sight of a skinned carcass was as ordinary as a loaf of bread. They walked past hanging meat the way we walk past vending machines. But something else grew into shambles alongside the butchers. a kind of intimacy with death that most modern people never experience. The butchers did not outsource the killing. They did not buy prepackaged cuts from a warehouse. They looked the animal in the eye, and then they ended its life with their own hands. Every day, 4 generations. That changes a person. It changes a street. The timber frames of the Shambles absorbed not just the smell of blood, but the rhythm of killing. The thud of the hammer, the slide of the knife, the heavy, wet sound of organs being pulled from a body cavity. These were the sounds of commerce. These were the sounds of breakfast and dinner and the weekly shopping trip. Children grew up hearing them. Apprentices learned to make them. And the old butchers who could no longer lift a cleaver sat in doorways and listened to the next generation continue the work. The street became a living thing, a creature with its own appetite. Every morning it demanded fresh meat. Every evening it produced waste. And the waste did not disappear. That is the part the history books soften. The blood drained into the gutter, but the bones and the fat and the scraps too small to sell they piled up behind the shops. In corners, in alleys, in spaces between buildings that no one ever cleaned because cleaning meant stopping and stopping meant losing money. So the piles grew, and as they grew they attracted attention. Rats first, then stray dogs, then the kind of insects that thrive on decay. The Shambles buzzed, not with conversation, with flies. Thousands of them, thick clouds that rose from the waste and settled on the fresh meat and then rose again. The butchers waved them away. Customers brushed them aside. Everyone accepted that flies were simply part of shopping. A medieval housewife did not expect a fly-free steak. She expected a steak. Period. This is difficult for a modern mind to hold. We have sanitized our food, wrapped it in plastic, washed our hands so often that we have forgotten what real dirt feels like. The Shambles was not dirty because the people were lazy. It was dirty because the system produced filth faster than any human could remove it. And after a while, the people stopped trying. They built higher thresholds on their doors to keep the liquid from flowing inside. They wore boots that could handle the mud. They learned to breathe through their mouths on hot summer days. They adapted. That is what humans do. We adapt to horror. We adapt to disgust. We adapt to conditions that would make a modern health inspector weep. And then we call it normal. The butchers of the Shambles did not see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as providers. They fed a city. They raised families. They attended church and paid their taxes and buried their dead in consecrated ground. But the street they built became something else. A place where the boundary between fresh and rotten, between living and dead, between dinner and garbage grew thin. So thin that you could barely tell where one ended and the other began. That is the second secret of Shambles. It was not just a street of butchers. It was a street where butchery became the air itself. You did not need to enter a shop to experience it. You just had to breathe. And as the centuries passed, the street learned to hide its true nature behind leaning walls and dark doorways. But the gutters never forgot. They could not. The stone had absorbed too much. And the rain kept falling. And the blood kept flowing. And the Shambles kept doing what it did best, feeding the living while standing knee-deep in the dead. Which leads directly to the third keynote. Because blood in the gutter is one thing. But what happened when that blood mixed with everything else that ended up on the street is a story most tour guides will never tell you. Blood in the gutter is one thing. But what happened when that blood mixed with everything else that ended up on the street is a story most tour guides will never tell you. Because the gutter that ran down the center of the Shambles was not designed for blood alone. It was designed for everything. And in the Middle Ages, everything meant exactly that. The butchers contributed their share every single day. Gallons of blood from slaughtered animals. Fat that hardened in the cold and turned rancid in the heat. Organs that no customer wanted. Bones stripped clean. Hide scraps. Hooves. All of it went into the same narrow channel that ran the length of the street. But the butchers were not the only ones using the gutter. The Shambles was a working street filled with working people. They lived above their shops. They cooked and ate and slept just feet from where the blood flowed. And when they needed to dispose of something, they did not walk to a dump. There was no dump. There was only the street. So into the gutter went dishwater and cooking grease and the remains of meals that had gone bad. Into the gutter went the contents of chamber pots emptied from upper windows with a shouted warning to anyone below. Into the gutter went whatever the tanners and the leather workers and the sausage makers could not sell. The gutter asked no questions. The gutter made no judgments. It simply carried everything downhill toward the river and hoped for rain. But hope is not a drainage plan, and the Shambles had too many people and too few solutions. The gutter was narrow, easily blocked. A few bones wedged together could stop the flow completely. Then the blood would pool. It would spread across the street and settle into the low spots and sit there until someone or something moved it. On warm days, the pool grew thick. It developed a skin, a crust of dried blood and dust, and whatever else had drifted into it. Children sometimes poked at it with sticks, because children have always been fascinated by things that disgust adults. Their mothers pulled them away and scolded them, and then went back to bargaining for a cut of beef that had been hanging next to that same pool all morning. This was not hypocrisy. This was survival. You cannot afford to be squeamish when hunger is the alternative. The medieval stomach was stronger than ours. It had to be. It processed meat that had sat in the sun. It swallowed bread that had been handled by 100 unwashed hands. It digested stews made with water from the same gutter when the river flooded and the well ran brackish. People got sick often, but they also got used to it. The body adapts. The mind adapts. And the Shambles adapted by developing its own rhythm. Morning brought the slaughter. The gutter ran red and fast. By midday, the flow slowed. The blood began to clot in the channel. By afternoon, the flies arrived in force. Their humming became the background music of the street, a low, constant buzz that residents stopped noticing after their first week. Visitors noticed. Visitors always noticed, but there were few visitors in those early centuries. The Shambles was not a destination. It was a neighborhood, and neighborhoods keep their secrets close. One secret was how far the blood could travel. On a rainy day, the gutter became a stream. Red water poured down the slope of the street and into the lower lanes of York. It reached the fish market. It reached the tanner's quarter. It reached the river itself, where fishermen pulled up their nets and found nothing but questions. The city knew where the blood came from, but the butchers paid taxes. The butchers fed the rich and the poor alike. No mayor wanted to shut down the street that filled the city's bellies. So the blood kept flowing, year after year, century after century, until the stones themselves were stained. Archaeologists have noticed this. When they dig beneath the Shambles, they find soil that is darker than ordinary dirt, richer in some ways, more fertile, because blood is full of iron and nitrogen. It fertilizes the ground even as it offends the nose. The medieval street was literally built on a foundation of organic waste compressed and decomposed and compressed again until it became something like earth. But not quite earth. Something else. Something that smells of rain and rust and a sweetness that turns the stomach if you think about it too long. The gutter was not the only channel. The ground beneath the Shambles was porous. Liquid did not just flow on the surface. It seeped downward into the soil and the clay and the rubble of older buildings that had stood on this spot centuries before the butchers arrived. Roman foundations, Viking workshops, the remnants of people who had also bled and cooked and disposed of their waste without asking where it went. All of it mixed together. All of it soaked into the same ground that tourists now walk on with their clean shoes and their bottled water and their assumption that the past is dry. The past is not dry. The past is wet. It is greasy. It is thick with things we have decided to forget. Every time it rains on the Shambles, the old smells return. Not strongly, just a hint. A whisper of something familiar and wrong that passes in a moment. Most visitors never notice, but the people who live there know. They have always known. The gutter is still there, by the way. It has been covered and uncovered and covered again. Modern drains now carry the waste away to treatment plants where it becomes someone else's problem. But the original channel remains beneath the cobblestones. A scar, a memory, a reminder that this street was never clean. Not really. And the blood that once ran through it did not disappear. It just went underground, which leads directly to the fourth keynote. Because a gutter full of blood is a problem. But a gutter full of blood surrounded by people who have stopped noticing is something else entirely. It is an invitation, and something answered that invitation every single night. A gutter full of blood is a problem. But a gutter full of blood surrounded by people who have stopped noticing is something else entirely. It is an invitation, and something answered that invitation every single night. The smell of the Shambles was not a single smell. It was a symphony of decay, each note played by a different source. The blood had its own sharp metallic voice. The fat contributed a low, greasy hum. The piles of discarded organs and hides and bones that accumulated behind every shop sang a deeper song, one of rot and fermentation and the slow, patient work of bacteria breaking down what the butchers had left behind. On summer evenings, the smell grew thick enough to taste. It hung in the narrow street like fog. It clung to clothing and hair and the wooden walls of the buildings themselves. Residents of the Shambles carried that smell with them wherever they went. To church, to market, to bed. They could not wash it off because the water they used for washing came from wells that were themselves contaminated by the same street. The cycle was closed. The Shambles fed itself. It drank itself. It breathed itself. And the people who lived there became part of it. But smell was not the worst part. Smell is only a warning. The worst part was what the smell attracted. Flies were the first and most obvious. They bred in the waste by the millions. Their larvae squirmed in the fat and the blood-soaked straw that butchers used to soak up the worst of the mess. A single butcher shop could produce generations of flies every week. Now multiply that by dozens of shops on both sides of the street and stretch that across centuries. The fly population of the Shambles was not a nuisance. It was a natural disaster happening every single day. They landed on fresh meat and rotting meat and everything in between. They landed on the faces of sleeping children and the bread cooling on windowsills and the open wounds of anyone unlucky enough to cut themselves while working. They carried disease from one shop to the next, from the waste pile to the dinner table, from the dead to the living. The people of the Shambles did not understand germs. They did not know that flies were spreading sickness. They only knew that the flies were everywhere and that nothing they did seemed to reduce their numbers. So they stopped trying. They waved them away from their food and their faces and went on with their lives. Because what else could they do? The rats were worse. Rats loved the Shambles with a devotion that bordered on religious. The waste behind the shops provided endless food. The wooden buildings provided endless shelter. The narrow passages between structures provided endless highways for rats to travel without ever being seen by human eyes. But they were seen. Of course they were seen. They grew bold in the darkness. They ran across floors at night. They nested in walls and ceilings and the thatched roofs that covered many of the older buildings. Sometimes they died in those walls, and the smell of their decomposition added another layer to the street's already overwhelming perfume of decay. The rats carried fleas. The fleas carried plague. This was not a coincidence. This was cause and effect written in the biology of the medieval city. The Shambles created the perfect environment for rats. The rats created the perfect environment for fleas. And the fleas waited for the right moment to introduce themselves to the human population. That moment came in 1348. But even before the Black Death, the people of the Shambles lived with constant low-grade illness. Stomach complaints were normal. Fevers were expected. Children died from infections that modern medicine treats with a week of antibiotics. A scratch from a knife could swell and turn black and kill a healthy butcher within days. The street did not mourn each death individually. There were too many. The dead were buried, and the living returned to work because the animals kept arriving, and the customers kept waiting, and the gutter kept flowing. There is something almost admirable about that level of endurance. Almost. But endurance has a cost. The people of the Shambles grew hard. Not cruel, but hard. They had to. Softness did not survive on a street where the air itself was poisonous, and the water was suspect, and the very ground beneath your feet was soaked with the remains of everything that had died there before you were born. They developed dark humor, gallows humor. The kind of jokes that shock outsiders and comfort insiders, because laughter is the only defense against despair that never stops working. A butcher might joke about the rats being his only loyal customers. A baker might complain that the flies added extra seasoning to his bread. A mother might tell her child that the smell would keep away the bad spirits, not realizing that the real danger had no spirit at all. It was just biology, just cause and effect, just a street designed by accident and maintained by desperation and inhabited by people who had no choice but to call it home. The Shambles was not evil. Evil requires intention. The Shambles was simply indifferent. It did not care if you lived or died. It did not care if the blood flowed, or if the rats multiplied, or if the flies carried sickness from one door to the next. It just existed, heavy and crooked and patient, waiting for the next generation to arrive and take their place in the same shops and the same homes and the same narrow street that had already consumed so many before them. That is the fourth secret. The smell was not the problem. The smell was only the symptom. The real problem was that the people of Shambles had learned to tolerate what should have been intolerable. Their noses had given up. Their stomachs had hardened. Their sense of normal had shifted so far from ours that they could eat their dinner within sight of a gutter full of blood and not lose their appetite. That tolerance kept them alive, but it also kept them trapped, because once you stop noticing the horror, you stop trying to fix it. And the Shambles continued exactly as it had for generations, until something arrived that even their hardened bodies could not ignore. Something that turned tolerance into terror and turned neighbors into corpses before the week was out. That something was the Black Death, and it loved the Shambles more than the rats ever did. That tolerance kept them alive, but it also kept them trapped, because once you stop noticing the horror, you stop trying to fix it. And the Shambles continued exactly as it had for generations, until something arrived that even their hardened bodies could not ignore. Something that turned tolerance into terror and turned neighbors into corpses before the week was out. That something was the Black Death, and it loved the Shambles more than the rats ever did. The plague arrived in York in the late summer of 1349. It did not knock. It did not ask permission. It seeped into the city like the blood from the gutters. Slowly at first, then all at once. The first victims showed the signs that everyone had learned to fear. Swellings in the groin and armpit, dark boils that oozed pus and blood, fevers so high that the sick hallucinated and screamed at empty corners. Death came within days, sometimes within hours. The Shambles was not prepared. No one was prepared, but the Shambles was uniquely vulnerable. Think about the conditions that the plague needed to spread. Crowded living spaces where people slept feet from one another. Poor sanitation where waste accumulated faster than it could be removed. Abundant vermin carrying infected fleas. A population already weakened by constant low-grade illness and malnutrition. The Shambles offered all of this in abundance. It was not just a target. It was a gift wrapped in timber and handed to the plague with a bow. The rats that had grown fat behind the butcher shops now carried death in their fleas. The flies that had bred in the blood and the waste now landed on the faces of the healthy and the dying alike. The very air that moved so slowly through the narrow street now carried droplets of infection from every cough and every breath. The Shambles became a furnace, and the fuel was human flesh. When the first butcher fell ill, his neighbors did not know what to do. There was no hospital. There was no ambulance. There was only the street and the shops and the families who had lived alongside one another for generations. Some tried to help. They brought water and prayed and held the dying man's hand as his skin turned black. They caught the plague from his breath, from his sweat, from the blood he coughed onto their sleeves. Within a week, the entire household was dead. Then the house next door began to sicken. Then the shop across the street. The plague moved through the Shambles like fire through dry grass. But fire leaves ash. The plague left empty beds and orphans and the terrible silence of a street that had always been noisy with commerce and conversation. The gutters still ran with blood. The butchers were no longer there to care. Many shops simply closed. The animals arrived from the countryside, but there was no one to slaughter them. They stood in the narrow street, confused and hungry and stepped over bodies that had fallen where they died. The smell of a shambles changed. The familiar odor of blood and fat and offal was joined by something new. The sweet, heavy stench of decomposition. Human this time, not animal. The dead outnumbered the living, and the living were too sick or too terrified to bury them. Some bodies lay where they had fallen for days. In doorways, on workshop floors, in beds still warm from the fever that had ended their lives. The rats grew bolder. They had always owned the night. Now they owned the day as well. They fed on the dead and then wandered into the homes of the dying, carrying their fleas, carrying the plague, carrying death from one doorway to the next with mechanical efficiency. The rats did not know they were killing. They were just hungry. The shambles had always fed them. Now the shambles was feeding them something far richer than scraps and offal. And the rats thrived. There's a dark poetry to this. The same street that had grown wealthy from killing animals now found itself being killed in turn. The butchers had spent generations learning to ignore the suffering of their livestock. Now they learned what it felt like to be the livestock, to be herded into a narrow space with no escape, to watch your neighbors fall one by one, to wait for your turn knowing that it was coming. The plague did not discriminate. It killed the wealthy and the poor, the pious and the sinful, the old who had survived a lifetime of hardship, and the young who had barely begun to live. A child who had played in the gutter just weeks ago now lay in a grave so shallow that dogs dug up the body before the earth had settled. A grandmother who had worked the same shop for 50 years now cooled on a pallet while her grandchildren wept in the corner. A master butcher who had killed 10,000 animals in his lifetime now died in the same position as the pigs he had slaughtered. On his back, eyes open, mouth agape, the same look of surprise that he had seen on so many animal faces. The shambles had always been a place of death, but death had been a tool, a means to an end. Now death was the end itself, and it was hungry. By the time the first wave of plague finally subsided, the shambles was a ghost of itself. Half the buildings stood empty. The shops that remained open were run by survivors who had lost everyone they loved. The blood still flowed in the gutters because the butchers who returned to work had no choice. The city still needed meat, but the rhythm had changed. The street fell hollow. The laughter was gone. The arguments over prices and portions and the quality of this cut versus that cut had been replaced by a terrible quiet. The flies still buzzed. The rats still scurried. But the human noise had dimmed because so many human voices had been silenced forever. The shambles survived the plague, but did not survive unchanged. The street had learned something about itself. It had learned that all the tolerance in the world could not protect you from a disease that did not care about your hardened stomach or your dark humor or your ability to ignore the smell of your own decaying neighborhood. The plague had come and gone, and it would come again, because the conditions that created the first outbreak had not been fixed. The blood still flowed. The waste still piled. The rats still feasted. And the shambles remained exactly what it had always been, a beautiful trap hidden in plain sight, which leads directly to the sixth and final keynote. Because surviving the plague was only half the story. The other half is how a street that spent centuries drowning in blood and death managed to convince the world that it was charming. That transformation did not happen by accident. It happened by forgetting. And forgetting is the most human thing of all. Surviving the plague was only half the story. The other half is how a street that spent centuries drowning in blood and death managed to convince the world that it was charming. That transformation did not happen by accident. It happened by forgetting. And forgetting is the most human thing of all. The shambles did not clean itself. The butchers did not suddenly develop modern sanitation. The rats did not leave. What changed was not the street, but the way people looked at it. Centuries passed. The worst of the butcher trade moved to other parts of the city. Slaughterhouses were built outside the walls. Regulations appeared. Laws that said animals could no longer be killed in the open where children could watch and blood could flow freely into the gutters. The change was slow. A generation here, a generation there. Each new wave of residents found the street slightly less filthy than the one before. The memory of the old shambles faded. Not completely, but enough. Enough that people could begin to see the buildings without smelling the fat. Enough that they could walk the narrow lane without feeling the blood beneath their boots. The timber frames that had once been stained with smoke and grease were cleaned or replaced or simply aged into a color that looked warm rather than soiled. The overhanging upper floors that had once made the street dark and dangerous now seemed quaint. Picturesque, the kind of place an artist might paint on a rainy afternoon. By the 1800s, the Shambles had completed its transformation. The butchers were mostly gone. In their place stood shops selling things that did not bleed. A baker, a tailor, a shop that sold candles, and another that sold rope, and another that sold the kind of small luxuries that medieval residents could never have afforded. The street was still poor, still crowded, still leaning, but the horror had retreated. Not because it was gone, but because no one was looking for it. The Victorian era brought a new way of seeing old things. The word medieval stopped meaning dirty and started meaning romantic. People began traveling to see ancient buildings not because they were useful, but because they were old. The Shambles benefited from this shift enormously. A street that had once been avoided by anyone who could afford to live elsewhere now attracted visitors who paid money to walk its crooked lanes and photograph its leaning walls. The irony was lost on no one except the tourists. The residents knew, they had always known, but they had also learned that silence was profitable. No one wanted to hear about the blood while eating a pastry. No one wanted to think about the rats while buying a souvenir. So the stories stayed in the family, passed down from grandparents to grandchildren like warnings. This is where great-grandfather worked. This is where the plague took his brother. This is where the gutter ran red every single day. The grandchildren listened and nodded and then went back to serving customers who had no idea what they were standing on. The forgetting was not complete. It could not be. The stones remembered too well. The timber remembered. The very shape of the street, a narrow canyon of leaning walls and dark corners, was a physical memory of the violence that had built it. But forgetting does not require total erasure. It only requires that most people stop asking questions. And most people did. They still do. The Shambles today is one of the most photographed streets in Britain. Millions of images capture its beauty every year. The same angles, the same light, the same charming, crooked buildings. Very few of those photographs show the gutter. Very few show the narrow channel that once carried blood and waste and the remains of everything the butchers could not sell. The gutter is still there, covered in places, paved over in others, but present. A scar that runs the length of the street like a confession that no one bothers to read. Visitors step over it without looking down. They have no reason to look. The guidebooks do not mention it. The shopkeepers do not point it out. The history that is sold on the Shambles is a clean history, a safe history, a history of kings and queens and architecture and the kind of details that fit comfortably on a postcard. The other history, the bloody history, the history of ordinary people drowning in filth and disease, and the slow grind of survival, is not for sale. It is free. It has always been free. You just have to know where to look. The Shambles hides its darker past in plain sight because no one is trying to hide it. The past is right there, in the gutters, in the leaning walls, in the dark corners where the sun never reaches. It does not need to be uncovered. It only needs to be seen. But seeing requires willingness. It requires looking at the beautiful street and asking the ugly questions. Why are the buildings leaning? Because the ground beneath them is soft. Why is the ground soft? Because centuries of blood and waste and human despair soaked into the earth and never left. Why is the street so narrow? Because every inch of space was too valuable to waste on light or air or the comfort of the people who live there. These questions are not difficult. They are just uncomfortable. And discomfort does not sell fudge. The Shambles has become a master of disguise. It presents itself as a fairy tale, knowing that fairy tales are safe. Fairy tales have clear morals and happy endings and monsters that are easy to identify. The real story of the Shambles has none of those things. Its monsters were not dragons or witches. They were flies and rats, and the indifference of neighbors who had seen too much death to cry anymore. Its moral is not clear. Its ending is not happy. It just continued, day after day, century after century. Blood and work and sleep and more blood. That is the sixth secret. The shambles did not become charming because it cleaned itself up. It became charming because we stopped looking closely enough to see the stains. The street did not change. We did. We decided that old meant beautiful and crooked meant quaint and narrow meant cozy. We decided that 1,000 years of suffering could be packaged into a single photograph and sold to anyone with a credit card. The shambles accepted this decision. It accepted the tourists and the shops and the fudge and the fairy tale. It accepted the forgetting. But the past does not need to be remembered to exist. It exists in the gutters and the foundations and the soil that archaeologists dig up only to find that the earth itself is darker here, richer, stained. The shambles is not haunted by ghosts. It is haunted by reality, the reality of what it really was, the reality of what we choose not to see. And the most frightening part is that the street is not unique. Every old place has a hidden history. Every beautiful building stands on ground that has absorbed things we would rather not name. The shambles is just honest enough to leave the evidence where we can find it, if we ever decide to look.